Otherwise, good morning, everybody. It's Chancellor from Verst Carbon. I'm the Director of Carbon Projects here at Verst Carbon. We support companies in developing carbon projects, provide advisory services, climate technology, as well as capacity building sessions, such as what we're having here today. Today's session is the fourth or fifth in our gold standard capacity building series, and we shall be focusing on how do we develop an afforestation, reforestation carbon project. However, before we get started, I've got my colleagues from the department who will be supporting today's conversation and ask them to also introduce themselves. Then we get started. Zena.
Hello, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Diana Chelimo. I am a carbon associate at Verst Carbon. I lead the agriculture, forestry, and other land use carbon initiatives at Verst, and I will be assisting Charles in today's webinar. Thanks.
Also, to support today's webinar is Sandra and Violet will be helping us in responding to your questions in the Q&A section as well as the comment section. Violet, Sandra, please introduce yourselves.
Hello everyone, Hi everyone, my name is Violet Giroter. I also work at Verst Carbon as a carbon associate for energy projects, and glad to have you again in this session. Yes, thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sandra Komboka and I'm a carbon associate at Verst Carbon. Glad to have everyone in attendance.
Thank you. That said, allow me to switch off my video to focus on the screens. As we mentioned earlier, this recording will be made available. We shall share the recording. We shall share the recording as well as the slides for your learning purposes. And of course, if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to find the other preceding instructions or webinars. Key to note here is that whereas we shall be giving you the general nuances of carbon markets, effort has been made to focus on the gold standard certification process, because that is part of the programming we are currently having. That said, I hope you enjoy the session. Please feel free to post any questions in the Q&A section or comment section. But if you have got any project specific questions, please feel free to email us and we'll be able to respond to you soonest. This presentation and the accompanying materials was developed by Somerset Origination as part of a program overseen by the Gold Standard Foundation and funded by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. We as Verst Carbon are one of 7 companies who are part of the program that we participated in designing the slides and of course the content, and now we are participating in the delivery. For those of you who have been with us, we started off with the introduction to carbon markets on 28th of March, and then followed by the following Friday, certification of a gold standard climate mitigation projects on the 4th of April. And last week, we were able to look at the nuances behind developing a renewable energy. For today's session, for the next 2 hours, we shall be focusing on afforestation and reforestation project. And then tomorrow, next week, Friday, we shall conclude with the improved cook source. However, we intend to be launching our Verst Carbon Academy. Verst Academy, that is basically an e-learning platform where you get to learn again on the carbon markets at no cost, at your own pace, and hopefully get a certification at the end of it. Otherwise, we shall also be having similar such webinars in the next quarter as part of our effort to make sure we reach out to as many people as possible. Now, key to note here is that whereas we are focusing on afforestation and reforestation, I want to put it out there that we fully understand the fact that there's a lot of interest to see how can one monetize, how can one get carbon credits from growing trees. That is well noted and be able to provide the various nuances. Key thing to note is that afforestation and reforestation, they fall under the class of what we call AFOLU, that is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. That is to say, within AFOLU, we have afforestation and reforestation. We also have got agroforestry, RED+, we also have things like solar carbon and whatnot. But for today's conversation, we shall be restricting our our delivery into the areas of afforestation and reforestation. Nevertheless, should you have any question, please feel free to reach out and to respond to the same. Like what we did last time, there'll be 4 modules. The first one is just a general introduction to afforestation, reforestation. The second module to be taken by my colleague Ziana is how do we go about quantifying emissions reduction from the forestry sector. And then I will come back in to give you guidelines and nuances on the eligibility, applicability, and additionality. For example, you're wondering if there is a natural forest, for example, in the Congo Basin, can you get carbon credits from that? Or if, for example, I'm doing a 10-acre plot, can I get carbon for that? So we'll be able to look at the different nuances that speaks to assessing eligibility, its applicability, additionality of afforestation, reforestation carbon project. And then lastly, Ziana will come back in and talk about how do you go about the implementation, monitoring, and reporting procedures for such kind of carbon project. And of course, anytime if you have a question, please post in the channel and we'll be able to respond to you. For the first module, we have got, we're going to learn about afforestation and reforestation projects. And our hope is that by the end of this session, you will be able to understand what our gold standard afforestation and reforestation project is all about. Again, just to reemphasize, you can develop an afforestation project using the gold standard registry or the Vera registry as well as the CDM. We shall focus on the principles and guidelines within the gold standard framework. But nevertheless, when it comes to some of the technical approaches, they tend to cut across the different registries. We also hope to help you identify the key standard documents relevant to an afforestation and reforestation project. We're also looking at how to learn what the steps are implementing an afforestation and reforestation project, understand the different methodologies and requirements that needs to be followed, and last but not least, you have to acknowledge the importance of the contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. As you would recall, from the very first topic we had a couple of weeks ago, the Gold Standard Registry is very keen to make sure that any climate mitigation project that you're developing is aligned with, is geared towards the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals that we all espouse to realize. And for the purposes of today's conversation, we'll be looking at the case of a fictional carbon project developer. In this case, it's called Carbon Verst, just to help us with the understanding of the concepts. So in this case, the developer, you're considering to implement an afforestation reforestation project within the standard. And key thing here to note is that you're very keen to plan on how to plant and facilitate the growth of trees on land that will otherwise not have trees. Again, we are looking at ARR, AR if you like, and you're not looking at agroforestry or soil organic carbon or grasslands project. Now, the first question that you need to ask yourself is, what's an afforestation reforestation project? Now, this term is synonymous to when you hear me saying afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation, ARR. So whenever you hear me mention ARR, just remember we're dealing with afforestation, reforestation, and vegetation. And just again, to make sure we're all on the same page, afforestation is simply you're trying to plant trees where there are none. Reforestation is where you're trying to plant trees to restore what was deforested. And the same applies for revegetation, where basically you're trying to restore the vegetation within the particular ecosystem. Now, you need to ask yourself that what are some of the key elements that you need to consider as you're designing your project. And of course, in this case will be, what will be some of the intentions? What are you really trying to achieve here? And of course, if you're doing that, one thing you have to take note is this. Number one is that whenever you're trying to do an ARR project and you're planting a particular species, it is very preferable to make sure that you're focusing on those which are classified or known as indigenous. And where possible, we try to make sure that whatever species you're going to be growing, it's not invasive, because there are those known impacts of invasive species. And of course, that speaks to making sure there's minimal amount of disturbance within the ecosystem. Now, for you also to be able to start sequestering, the subsequent forest land must have greater than at least 10% canopy cover to be considered a forest, okay? And the trees are identified by reaching a 5-meter height at maturity. To simply say that if it's not at 5 meters in height, then most likely you might have challenges in the quantification process. As I said, any tree planted must be evidenced to be non-invasive, and the planting and the growing activity should cause the minimal amount of disturbance to the soil carbon stocks. Okay, remember, we also have to ask yourself, how do we sequester carbon to trees? And this is something we're going to be covering in the subsequent sections. Now that as a developer, you're fully clear in terms of what you're trying to do, you need to now look at some of the specific elements that speaks to the gold standard project certification process. Now, whereas we understand that one project to another one will be very different ones, there are a number of key components that tend to be cross-cutting with respect to the project design. And within the gold standard, this variation is shown through what we call modeling units. Okay, we appreciate that you want to grow, let's say, acacia trees in Kenya, and let's say elsewhere, let's say in Ghana. Yes, the two distinct projects, but some of the approaches often tends to be similar, and this is how, or what we call modeling units within the gold standard. All projects are designed around modeling units, which is a distinct homogeneous part of the eligible project area, where the carbon stocks will be quantified using the approved or applicable gold standard methodology. Now, key to note here is that a single project might have multiple modeling units. Okay, remember, if you're looking to do an afforestation, let's say within 1,000 hectares, whereas we want to do proper forecasting within 1,000 hectares, we have to chop up the project area into small bits of land for us to be able to assess some of the business scenarios and whatnot, and that's what we're trying to call or refer to as the modeling units. Now, it's also very important for one to understand how one modeling unit will be distinguished from another one. So there's the active planting that you will be doing as the developer, as well as there's what we call the assisted natural regeneration. Because remember, when you're planting your trees and of course working towards the growing of the trees, what tends to happen is that the land picks up the signal that, hey, it's now a good time for us to regenerate the ecosystem. So you start seeing other species or trees or even yours starting to naturally regenerate. Of course, depending on the fruit trees, the kind of tree you're dealing with, the process of pollination, of course, then you understand then within a well-designed project, we'll be getting what you call the assisted natural regeneration, and that has to be modeled. Modeling units must vary from one to another, and the active planting of saplings or assisted natural regeneration, ANR, would be essential. In some cases, you might have indirect methods like considering the use of extension zones to allow for natural succession, which will otherwise be suppressed. ANR can often be cheaper to implement with a trade-off of a slower growth. Yeah. So whenever, of course, you're looking at making sure that over time, the soil itself is able to regenerate and grow trees, that of course is going to be possible. But of course, it's not going to be happening as fast as you planting the saplings and of course growing the stem. Another thing you need to consider when you're looking at or examining the different modeling units is the increase in carbon sequestration. Now, regardless of active planting or ANR, all projects must aim to increase carbon sequestration through increasing the biomass stocks within a modeling unit, and this is how you're able to get the carbon credits. Just to remind everybody again here, remember that when you're looking at sequestering carbon with trees, the carbon is often stored within the tree's biomass, which can be what we call above ground biomass and below ground biomass, with the above ground biomass being things like the stems and the branches, with the below ground biomass being, in this case, being the root ecosystem. And of course, we shall be looking at this item in detail as we progress with today's discussion. Now, for those of you who be considering agroforestry components, you need to take note that some modeling units might have a lower density of tree planting, and instead of pairing the land use with the productive options such as agriculture or superpasture, you can consider having a very distinct project from ARR and then agroforestry. Remember that agroforestry here, we are talking about let's say I've got 10 hectares of land. Part of it is growing coffee, and so you're putting what you call things like the shade trees. So you cannot compare the density of the tree cover from the shade trees as to when you have got 10 hectares of land and you're simply putting, let's say, acacia. The tree density where it's wholly ARR will be greater than the tree density in the case of agroforestry. So those are some of the key nuances you need to take into consideration as you're undertaking your project. Now, key to note also is that some modeling units might focus on smallholder plots managed by collective of individual small landholders, and this is often a great way of driving for the SDG impact. And of course, most importantly, is aggregation. Aggregation is whereby when you do your assessment, you find that the benefits of, let's say, reforesting 2 acres of land might not be cost effective. Of course, it's a benefit to the ecosystem, but not commercial viability. In this scenario, we often suggest them you are aggregated in a pool of so many other similar small landowners, and make sure you develop the project not as one or not as your 2-acre plot, but instead as a group project of, let's say, 1,000 2-acre small land, smallholder farmers. Okay, that's way you're able to enjoy the benefits of what you call the economies of scale, the registration fees, sampling fees, and whatnot. Again, we shall be looking at this further in detail when we're looking at the project design. Now, remember, as I've mentioned, that when you're looking at the soil organic carbon, you're not just looking at the tree's biomass. Depending on how you design and depending on your flexibility in doing proper sampling, you can also consider soil organic carbon within certain ARR projects. Again, as I mentioned, it all comes down to how you design and the ability to make sure you can be able to monitor the different components, as we shall be looking at that in module 2. Like in any project, you must be able to start by assessing the baseline situation. Remember, we make sure that baseline is what is the current scenario as it is there. Here in this case, you can see the images are shown you on the screen, and we shall be looking at this is what is there right now, and what is it that we are looking at a couple of months or years down the line. So this means that you as a developer, you're not only determining the current biomass stock, but also future potential biomass stocks based on your project design. You're living in, let's say you own 100 acres of land, and maybe you want to do the ARR in parts of it. Well, it's quite obvious that maybe you say, I want to only focus on 70 acres out of the 100, and even in the 70 acres, I'm going to have a schedule or a phased approach towards the ARR. So this means that when you are doing your baseline study or scenario determination, you need to look at both your current biomass stocks and also what will be the potential of the future based again with your project design. In most projects, the baseline shows the current land use. So for example, if you can see on the screen, the barren land is shown or the agricultural land being maintained during the baseline. However, in many cases, the most plausible scenario may be a change in land use. So for example, from a barren land to an open forest or even a shrubland. And that's why we talk about agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So depending again with the intention of the purpose, you might see a scenario where you're changing the current land use. We know situations whereby these philanthropists who, or even just individual citizens in Africa, they say, hey, I want to convert this shrubland into an ecotourism park of sorts, okay? That's a demonstration of a change in land use, but depending on the kind of approach, you can demonstrate an increase in the biomass, the carbon stock, and as well as the biodiversity. And when you're looking at biodiversity, then there could be other considerations you take it into account. For example, within the very ecosystem and what you call the CCB standard, which will be able to help you in accounting for biodiversity. But for the case of the goals, and in this case, in principle, we'll be looking at the carbon sequestration, of course, the additional SDG targets that you're able to cover. Now, it is possible that different parcels of lands might have different current and responsible alternative land use scenarios, and of course, you as the owner of the land must be able to make sure you're able to document all of this. Now, once you've been able to determine the best scenario, you will now need to think through what will be the project looking like. Now, through a co-design approach with local communities, you can determine the best approach is to create a mixed fruit and native tree conservation forest, providing a sustainable supply of food to local communities, as well as enhancing local biodiversity. Now, this is going to be very important because remember, in the case of reforestation, there could be a reason why there's a case of deforestation within the project boundary or the project area. Now, you need to make sure you're able to identify all the drivers of degradation and design the mitigation activities and adaptation activities that will be able to make sure you are accounting for overcoming all those drivers of degradation. For example, consider a mangrove ecosystem whereby the mangroves are deforested because of, let's say, people are trying to chop down the mangrove trees for firewood, or let's say fishermen doing bait fishing, and therefore they're tampering with the soil structure and, of course, the root ecosystem. So if you identify those as the two drivers of degradation, in your project design, you must clearly articulate what are you doing differently or how are you going to do things differently to make sure you tackle those two drivers of degradation. That means, for example, you set up a sort of community woodlots for the firewood people to be harvesting from and keep off the mangroves. That means, for example, you consider if the fishermen can consider aquaculture as opposed to them practicing bait fish farming. So you really have to work very closely with the local communities and see how best can you design the program to make sure that whatever trees you're putting in place will not be chopped down later on for firewood or anything else. Again, in the case of a mangrove ecosystem, you can consider, for example, doing beekeeping with more bees like the mangrove forest, and therefore tell the local communities, hey, help us grow and nurture this mangrove ecosystem, and the honey that comes from the beehives will entirely belong to you, but keep off the mangrove. So that design taking process is something you need to work very closely with the local communities to make sure that whatever you're doing, it's a good or a benefit that the communities fully appreciate and understand. So a question to the audience, and please feel free to put your thinking on the chat, and my colleagues will be able to review and provide guidelines. What is the business scenario of a gold standard AR project? What is the business scenario for a gold standard project? Please put your answers on the box. Otherwise, our slides will be able to give a more detailed responses for you. Now, again, we have to reiterate the principles of the gold standard because these are documents or these are procedures that must be implemented. If you can remember from our second lesson, we looked at the hierarchy of standard documents, and this is just a recap for those of you who are there, and those of you who are not there, please go to our second module to look at the understanding of the principles and requirements, activity requirements, methodologies, and product requirements insofar as the gold standard is concerned. So in terms of hierarchy, and here meaning in terms of order of precedence, which is the superior document, if you like, we have got the firstly, we talk about the principles and requirements as being the ones in principle, as you can see on your left. And within the principles and requirements, there are a number of documents highlighted in green. Those in green simply means that those are things, those are documents, those are principles, those are values that you must make sure you adhere to and you design them within the project. So there's a principles and requirements document. It's a slightly lengthy document. It really gives you insights on who and what the gold standard is trying to achieve. Stakeholder requirements. It clearly indicates what are the bare minimums for you to do a local stakeholder consultation. That was covered in the second session. Then you've got stakeholder guidelines. How do you convene the duration of notice? How do you go about identifying the stakeholders? How do you capture the feedback and whatnot? Safeguarding principles as well. For example, how do you make sure you're not in breach of the human rights? You know, indigenous peoples and communities are very important and integral parts of the ecosystem. How do you safeguard their interests? And of course, gender equality as well, just to make sure that your project is designed with gender equality in mind. Now, the second one you can see is the POA requirements. It is optional, again, depending on what you're trying to do. Are you trying to do a group project, for example? For example, it could be you're trying to do an ecosystem restoration that is transitioning Kenya and Tanzania, and therefore you want to have the voluntary project activity 1 being Kenya, and the second one, voluntary project activity 2, being in Tanzania. For those of you who might have missed that lesson again, please go back and look at topic 2 to understand the nuances between POA, that is program of activities, and VPA, that is voluntary project activity. The second document, or in the hierarchy of standard documents, we also call the activity requirements. And in this case here, you will be required to look at the one for the land use and forest to see what it requires you to do. Then thirdly are the methodologies. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the different methodologies applicable in a forest sector. So you must go down to the forestry ecosystem and you select the most appropriate methodology. The methodology could either be one that has been designed for the gold standard specifically, or one that has been adopted from the Clean Development Council, the CDM. And my colleagues should be sharing with you a link or to the web page that shows all the different standards applicable to gold standard climate mitigation program. And of course, the last but not least is that the product requirements. That is the how do we go about quantifying the carbon credits or emissions reduction with respect to the gold standard, and we shall be covering some of this in the next couple of slides. Now, after fully understanding the 5 mandatory principles and requirement documents, you as a developer must look at the next level of requirements, that is in this case the activity requirements and methodologies. Now, by looking at the land use and forest requirements, you'll be able to identify that the LUF, that is land use and forest requirements, are applicable within ARR project activities. Now, within the documentation, you notice that the LUF requirements set out the necessary guidelines and requirements for all land use and forestry and agricultural projects, including ARR. So, for example, within the documentation, you'll be able to see that additionality may be demonstrated by, as per the LF requirements. It will give you the positive list by which certain projects are deemed as additional as long as they meet multiple defined requirements, such as non-mandatory project activities, no intention of commercial use of timber, or projects in the least developed countries. Yeah, I know those conditions might be interesting. Remember, for you to demonstrate additionality, you must be able to show that there is no regulatory requirement. But if it's a regulatory requirement, but there's still a case to prove or justify ARR, you need to show that, for example, like in the case of Kenya, there are laws prohibiting mangrove destruction for flood or whatever. However, enforcement has been a challenge sometimes in some of the areas, depending again on the location, and therefore we can say that whereas it's a mandatory project activity for the government, but implementation has been a challenge, and we must show a scientific document that can back it up. Otherwise, the key requirement is that for you to be eligible for ARR within the positive list, then it must be a non-mandatory ARR activity. For the gold standard, they're very, very clear that there should be no intention whatsoever from you, the developer, from commercializing the trees for timber business. Yes, that is a prohibitive activity, and if that is the case, then gold standard registry will not be for you. And then, of course, if your country falls in what you call the least developed countries, then also you're deemed to be automatically additional. If you've got any questions with respect to those requirements, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we shall be able to revert to the same. Now, the LUF requirements will need to be reviewed in order to determine if you meet the positive list requirements. And for you as the developer, as I mentioned, you can easily look up the Gold Standard website to look at the different applicable methodologies. And you need to find a single methodology that will be able to speak to your case. For the case of the Gold Standard, they have their own customized methodology. It's called methodology for afforestation, GHG emissions reduction, and sequestration. I repeat, methodology for afforestation, reforestation, GHG emissions reduction, and quantification. Like I said, the beauty of all these methodologies is that they tell you everything and anything you need to know with respect to developing your projects in terms of how do you quantify emissions reduction, how do you account for leakage, how do you do your on-time reporting notification, how do you do your baseline study. All these are standalone chapters within the methodology, and to be able to give you the answers, all you need is just a bit of technical background on forestry matters to be able to interpret. Otherwise, we as are available to give you guidelines on the same. Again, another question: what activity requirements and methodologies are applicable to the gold standard ARR projects? What activity requirements? Remember the different requirements. I'm not asking about what activity requirements and methodologies are applicable to the gold standard carbon projects. Take it back. Okay, if you look at here, you see that the activity requirements, there is the first activity requirements and land use and forestry activity requirements, and then the methodologies. Those are the two items that you need to make sure that if you are developing carbon projects, you keep them in mind. Okay, and as I mentioned before, you consider using the CDM methodology. Look and see if the gold standard own methodology for the particular mitigation activity. If the answer is yes, then you'll be required to use it. And of course, I've spoken a bit about mangroves and wetlands. These are a very, very, very unique ecosystem. And you'll find that most standards, whereas they have a methodology for ARR, they have another unique methodology for mangroves, wetlands, peats, all those kinds of ecosystem. At this point in time, I want to stop there for this particular module. Invite you to post any question that you have within the chat box or Q&A section, and my colleagues will be able to respond to the same. Otherwise, I hope that basic introduction has been useful. Otherwise, allow me to ask my colleague Ziana to step in and take you through module 2. I'll see you back in module 3. Thank you. Over to you, Ziana.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Thanks for that. So just a moment, I share my screen. Right, so this is module 2, as Charles has mentioned. We'll be looking at emission reduction quantification under the gold standard methodology. So in this module, we are going to learn about calculating emission reductions. Okay, just a moment. So just a moment, sorry. Let me reshare again. Okay. Yep. Okay, I hope now you can see the screen. So as I was saying, in this module, we will be going through how to calculate emission reductions for a forestry project. As Charles has mentioned, there is a project by Carbon First. So we will be looking at this hypothetical project. We look at how the most used impact quantification methodology is, the emission reduction quantification, the baseline parameters, and the project parameters. So for under gold standard, there is one methodology for afforestation and reforestation. So in this case, it makes Carbon First decision very easy because they don't have to look at many methodologies to decide which one they'll use, because there's only one. And the details of this methodology can be found on the gold standard SDG impact quantification methodologies webpage. So we'll attach a link to that so that then you can go and see for yourself and read it in further detail. And in addition to this methodology, Carbon First also needs to be sure to look at the land use and forest activity requirements. I think before I joined, I had seen some of the questions in the chat asking what is this methodology applicable for grasslands, peatlands, mangroves? So the activity tool, the land use and forestry activity requirement would help you then know if your project then fits into that. If a peatland is applicable or a grassland is applicable, which so you can then go and read further on that. And so just a note is that I know you wonder sometimes there's a new methodology released, what happens when that happens? So when a new methodology is reviewed and updated by gold standard, it receives a new version number from a defined date, and these projects will now use the new version of the methodology, while existing projects will continue on the version number which they were validated. So these projects will switch to the new version when they enter a new crediting period, and so far, there are only 63 A&R VPAs which are listed on the gold standard registry compared to over 2,000 for Cookstore VPAs. So as you can see from the screen, it shows that this methodology at the moment is version 2.1. So as you're doing your project, you will quote that you're using version 2.1, which is the latest version of the project. So now moving over to the baseline scenario. This is the most plausible alternative land use scenario that would occur without the implementation of the project. It serves as the reference against which the project's carbon emission reductions are measured. And for A&R project, that involves understanding the current and potential future land use options in the absence of the project. The most plausible scenario is dependent on a number of factors such as grazing, wood harvesting, soil quality, and economic incentives. The baseline scenario can include maintaining the current land use, that is, there are no changes in biomass stocks or a land use change, which then results in an increase in biomass. Any decrease in biomass will be recorded as no change. So it is possible that different parcels of land may have different current and most plausible alternative land use scenarios. In this case, the project will need to split into modeling units or strata, as Charles had mentioned, with each modeling unit assessed separately. So for Carbon First, they would first assess the baseline scenario of the project area and determine that the most plausible scenario is for half the site to remain as agricultural land, a quarter of the site to be barren land, which will remain as barren land, and the remaining quarter of the site to be converted from barren land to an open savanna, creating two separate modeling units. So Carbon First identifies that the area will not become forest without the project due to the economic benefit of agriculture on half the site, and due to grazing and fuel oil extraction pressures for the other half. Carbon First conducts a baseline study following the A&R methodology, as I mentioned, and they use these requirements to determine current and future baseline biomass stocks, as well as soil management inputs with exact parameters, which I will describe later on in this module. So don't worry about that. And just a note that this study is separate from any SDG impact monitoring required, unless these impacts are derived from changes in biomass. And then in terms of the project scenario, once the baseline scenario has been determined, Carbon First will now envisage the project. So what is the mitigation activity that they are pursuing? So the project scenario can have a range of approaches. It can have active planting of trees, assisted natural regeneration through indirect methods, which exclude grazing, timber plantations, agroforestry, and silvopasture. And just for anyone who may be wondering, silvopasture is when you incorporate trees and pasture land. So through a co-design with local communities, Carbon First determines the best approach is to create a mixed fruit and a native tree conservation forest across most of the project area, providing a sustainable supply of food to local communities, as well as enhancing local biodiversity. So this project will also reserve 20% of the agricultural area in the baseline for productive timber plantation. And by doing this, they'll be able to create jobs and reduce some of the economic impact of the lost agriculture. So through the co-design process, local communities will identify which type of trees they prefer and why, so that Carbon First can identify which species will be the lowest risk to be harvested in the future for the conservation of forest, and which tree species may be most beneficial for the local community in the timber plantation. Through this through this process, the project is expected to contribute to a range of sustainable development goals. The project will also enhance carbon sequestration and also improve local livelihoods. So then, to ensure that this is sustainable, Carbon First will also have to continuously monitor the area for loss of trees, with monitoring and submission of tree growth being required at least 5 years or less. So that gives you a bit of an insight on the methodology, the baseline scenario, and the project scenario. So just as a question to the audience, in the chat box, and I know unfortunately you can see the answer on the screen, but just you can think about it for a minute. Why do you think community engagement and participation is key to an afforestation and reforestation project? So I know as much as you can see the answers projected, maybe you can give your own idea that has not been put out on the screen, and then my colleagues can then sort of mark them and see who's on point, who's a bit off. But community engagement and participation is really key and fundamental when you're doing afforestation and reforestation projects. So I'll give maybe 20 seconds for anyone who has a burning answer that is not on the screen, and they can answer, and we move on to the next slides. All right, so I had mentioned earlier that we'll speak about the baseline and project scenarios, parameters, sorry. So for the parameters, Carbon First will need to determine which parameters are applicable to them. So in this case, the methodology lays out the parameters depending on whether you are which carbon pool you're using. So if it's tree biomass, is it above ground, below ground, non-tree biomass, above ground or below ground, and finally soil for organic material. So the methodology does not take into account harvested wood and litter or line dead wood. But then for the first the first three carbon pools, so first starting with tree biomass, that is above ground and below ground, you'll have to measure it when you're doing the project, when you're doing your baseline, and also when you're measuring leakage. So I will explain what leakage is in a few, but you'll have to take that into account. And then for the non-tree biomass, that is above ground and below ground, you'll only have to measure it when you're conducting your baseline assessments. And then for finally the soil, which now manifests through the soil organic carbon, this will only measure, if you measure it in the baseline, then you also have to measure it in the project scenario. So for that one, it completely depends with your project and what it involves. So if you're not going to be measuring soil organic carbon, then you won't measure it in the baseline, neither will you measure it in the project scenario. So I hope the parameters there are clear. So in order to calculate the above ground and below ground biomass, Carbon First has to monitor a subset of parameters, just as I've mentioned before. And some of these parameters include stem volume, which we'll abbreviate as SV. This refers to the total volume of the stems or trunks of trees in a modeling unit per hectare. This measurement is an essential parameter in forestry and carbon accounting, as it helps estimate the amount of biomass and carbon stored in the trees. The other parameter that we will also measure is the biomass expansion factor, abbreviated as BEF. It is a multiplier used to estimate the total above ground biomass of a forest from the stem biomass or stem volume alone, since the stem biomass represents only a part of a tree's total biomass. So it includes branches, leaves, and sometimes roots. The BF accounts for these additional components to provide a more comprehensive estimate of the total biomass of the trees. And then another parameter is the basic wood density, which this refers to the mass of dry wood per unit volume, which is usually expressed in grams per cubic meter or kilograms per cubic meter. Depends on whichever you choose, but you can use either. And this is a key parameter in forestry and carbon accounting because it helps estimate the total biomass of trees based on their volume. Finally, there is the root to shoot ratio, which is the ratio of the biomass of a plant's roots to the biomass of its above ground parts, so the shoots in this case, which include the stems, branches, and the leaves. So Carbon First, we need to monitor the stem volume directly, whilst values of biomass expansion factor, that is the BEF, wood density, and the root to shoot ratio will typically utilize peer-reviewed or default values. So in this case, only the ones you need to go to the ground and measure yourself would be the stem volume, while the other parameters you can then find them through journals or which have the default values for this. So what does the calculation of emission reductions entail? So first, you've collected all the necessary information from each modeling unit, and then now you do your calculation. So first, you start with the baseline removals. As I've mentioned, you first look at your baseline scenario, what it entails, and then you then determine the total carbon stock in the baseline scenario, including the non-tree biomass, just as I've said in the parameters that we'll be looking into. So soil carbon must also be included if it will be monitored, just as I've said. And if the baseline is expected to increase in biomass, then the baseline value used in each subsequent year must increase to reflect this. After baseline removals have been calculated, next you must now do your project removals. And to calculate this, Carbon First must include the current carbon stocks for above and below ground biomass, as well as soil carbon if included. So just keep that in mind. The key ones that you're measuring are the above ground and below ground for tree biomass and non-tree biomass, and then soil carbon, it depends. So these values will derive from monitoring. However, for ex-ante calculations, growth models and soil carbon stock change factors can be applied to estimate the potential project removals. In addition, as Carbon First includes rotational forestry, which is now part of their project activities, as the project scenario in one of the modeling units, the maximum project removals is limited by the long-term average of carbon removals. As you can see in the slides on the screen, this is the average carbon stock across the lifetime of our project. So I hope up until there we are on the same page. Okay, so again, another question to the people in the audience or in the chat room. What monitoring techniques may be available for monitoring an afforestation and reforestation project? So again, I'll give you sort of like 30 seconds to quickly type in your answer, what you think are some of the monitoring techniques that could be available to an afforestation and reforestation project. Okay, so as you type in, I'll just also share the answer with you so that you can see if we're on the same wavelength or not. So projects may choose a mix of field-based and remote monitoring, or field-based monitoring. And field-based monitoring involves measuring the tree stem on a sample. So as it says, this is now on the ground, and then the digital monitoring utilizes satellite imagery. So I hope for the people who answered this question, we were together on that. All right, so proceeding with still calculating emission reductions. So moving on to the next steps. So once you've already done your baseline and project removals calculations, then now there are additional emissions that must be calculated. And due to the baseline scenario, it is likely that the project will displace some agriculture and grazing, which will then move to other areas, possibly causing deforestation or preventing similar tree growth to occur. So this is known as leakage. So just, I had mentioned that then I would define what leakage is. So I hope now, if you are curious on leakage or didn't know, I hope that gives you some clarity. So Carbon First will need to account for this leakage by determining the amount of grazing and agriculture displaced, that is, if there's any. And this is what now we call activity shifting. So by implementing the project in this area, the activities that were now happening, if there was grazing and agriculture going on, they've now moved or shifted to another area. So there are multiple ways that activity shifting can be quantified. However, they must use either a credible estimation or a representative survey to determine the degree of this activity shifting. The activity shifting will then be multiplied by the expected tree above and below ground biomass stocks in areas where the agriculture will move to, usually representative of the region the project takes place. Leakage from grazing may be simpler, that is using livestock records to determine the number of livestock displaced and the grazing density. In addition to leakage, there are other emissions that may need to be calculated as well, and these emissions include any usage of fertilizer as well as any disturbance and burning from site preparation. So Carbon First then determines that none of these additional emissions will either need to be accounted for or will not. So depending on how the activities in the project, the other emissions may be applicable or not. With removals and emissions now accounted for, Carbon First can now calculate the removal units, which will eventually be able to be issued as gold standard VERs, the verified emission reductions. So firstly, at a modeling unit level, the baseline removals, the leakage emissions, and other emissions are subtracted from the project removals with this value in tons of CO2 per hectare, then being multiplied by the planting area. And then the final step will now be to sum up all the modeling units across all the years up to the current year in order to determine the current total project removals. And before Carbon First can then initiate the sale of these credits, they will have to consider that an additional 20% of the credits will be held in a risk buffer pool, which will then be retired in case of any losses in the event of a wildfire or any other deforestation event. So I hope up until there, we are clear on the methodology and the emission reduction calculations together with the baseline and the project scenarios. So that brings me to the end of module 2. I don't know if there are any questions regarding that particular module. If there are, you can post them in the chat and in the QA, and me together with my colleagues will look out to answer them. Over to you, Charles, back to you. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ziana. And I can see more questions are coming. We will make sure we respond to all the questions as they come in. Now proceed to module 3, which is basically assessing the eligibility, applicability, and additionality. And as I mentioned earlier, that you must make sure that your project is in line with the different standard documents for the gold standard. And also, most importantly, you select the most appropriate methodology. For the case of ARR projects, I have posted in the chat the applicable methodology from the gold standard that will be used for ensuring you can address the eligibility, applicability, and additionality concerns of the AR carbon project development. Now, in this model, we're going to learn about a number of items, and we hope that you'll be able to understand all those 3 components and how they interplay within the development of the project. And as I've mentioned, that it's very important that you make sure that when you're designing your ARR project, you work very closely with maybe the forestry agency in your country, or a civil society or NGO or a development partner that has been doing a lot of this work on the ground, just for the purposes of gaining a lot of the technical knowledge for the particular project area. As well, make sure that you can work very closely with the community, because they're the ones who are going to be living there with your trees. The trees are growing from a day-to-day basis. So just making sure that you get their buy-in and the support will be very, very instrumental. Now, again, we are going to be really overemphasizing on the need to comply with the relevant gold standard documents within the respective hierarchy. And as I mentioned earlier, the principles and requirements is number 1, followed by the activity requirements, the impact quantification methodology, and of course the project product requirements, in this case now the carbon credits. As a developer, you must read the principles and requirements documents, all of them. There's really no let up in this, and we make sure we drop some of the links in case you didn't have these links to the principles and requirements. It's very important to make sure you're conversant with these guidelines, as they're going to be instrumental in you developing your project design for your respective projects. Now, the compliance, in case you're wondering, who does the compliance? For those who are not there again, remember, whereas the gold standard is based in Geneva, but the compliance will be checked not only in your project design document, but it must be validated by an accredited gold standard validation and verification body, or if you like, an auditor. So don't think that these guys are too far away to come to your projects in Africa, because they'll be able to, you'll be required to reach out to one of the accredited VVBs, and they come and check the compliance of your project as you reference it in the project design document. Now remember that during the feasibility study of your project, that the US developer should be able to establish the proposed project. You make sure that your proposed project is eligible before committing to any commercial or economic or investment for your project. That's why we do the feasibility, just see, are there any, is it technically viable? Is it going to make economic sense? Is it applicable to the gold standard? Because that question must be answered at the particular stage to make sure you don't go all into the respective investment. So please remember, the same way you develop a project, you first do a feasibility or even a pre-feasibility study to see the possibilities or the logic of you doing a project. Please apply the same approach when it comes to the carbon project, in this case by looking at the mitigation activity you're trying to do against or vis-a-vis or with respect to the applicable methodology from the respective carbon rates, in this case, the gold standard. Now, there are a number of eligible AR activities, as we mentioned previously. One, we've got active planting of trees. I think that's the most basic that most of us are doing. Of course, remember again, it comes down to scale. I'm not saying that you planting and growing 10 trees is not good enough. No, but I'm simply saying that is good. But if you're looking at it from a commercial lens in terms of carbon finance, then aggregation scale becomes important. Agroforestry will also be applicable within the prescribed methodology. And of course, as you know, agroforestry involves the planting of trees at a lower density to allow for crop production. So you need to ask yourself, are you doing a straight up planting and growing of trees, or you will be considering the case of agroforestry? There's also what you call silvopasture, whereby now we are saying you are planting trees at a lower density in a plot of land or a project area to allow for grazing by livestock. Okay, that is also applicable. Another consideration, as you can see on the third box there, is ANR, that is assisted natural regeneration. In this case, we're talking about applying indirect activities like exclusion fencing, but also through the reduction of pressures such as fuel harvesting to allow natural regeneration of trees. This is something I know has been done in some of the mangrove ecosystems here in Kenya's coastline, where the communities, the developers, and the Kenya Forestry Service have been able to put some sort of fences just to reduce some of the pressures that the ecosystem has been having from firewood harvesting of trees for firewood. And of course, that has been coupled with a lot of community engagement, installation of watchtowers and whatnot. Again, just to give some part of that forest, mangrove forest, a chance to just regrow, because it's quite expansive and it's very much remote. So there's only so much that you want to do. And lastly is what we call rotational forestry. This is the the periodic harvesting of trees for timber. Although I've mentioned that for rotational forestry project, for you to be eligible, you must be able to note that once the crediting period has come to an end, let's say the crediting period has been given and allowed to be, let's say, 10 years. Once the crediting period comes to an end, then you should understand that you will not be allowed to do any further harvest. The rationale behind rotational forestry and the difference between that and just doing brazen harvesting for timber is that You're only allowed to harvest because it's assumed that within the cutting period, you're harvesting, yes, but you're also restoring the forest by replanting. So there are a number of ways, for example, see the focus on pine and cypress because they're fast growing and also useful, good for timber. So there's a provision where that is allowed so long as you understand that once your cutting period comes to an end, then that comes to a stop. But if that provision not be made in the design document, then you'll not be allowed to engage in harvesting for timber in that case. Now, key to note is that for the particular methodology we have talked about for AR, this cannot be applicable within wetlands. However, a key thing to note is that mangrove planting used to be eligible within the gold standard AR methodology back in the day, but there's now a dedicated methodology. It's called blue carbon and freshwater wetlands methodology. And that is only where now, if you want to do mangrove ecosystem in the gold standard registry, you have to use that particular methodology and not this particular methodology, the one for AR, for mangrove ecosystems. Again, the reason being that mangroves are very unique ecosystems, and therefore they need special care, if I can put it that way. I don't know if it's very clear on your screen, but a question to you, I want you guys to just think about it and tell me what criteria should be considered when assessing the eligibility of an reforestation project. What criteria should be considered when assessing the eligibility of an reforestation project? I will give you about, let's say, 15 seconds to throw in your answers, and then we shall look at some of the criteria that I used to assess eligibility. 10 seconds, and then we look at the answers. Please, again, this is a learning webinar, so there's no right or wrong answers. Okay. Please put down your responses, please. Please put down your responses. So let's have a look. So one of the criteria is whether or not it's eligible under the land use and forest activity requirements. 2, remember, it must comply with the applicable methodology. 3, it must be an eligible activity. 4, it must comply with the host country laws and regulations. Okay, and last but not least is whether or not it's suitable within the community you're trying to implement this. Remember, before you even think about size and whatnot, we just look at the requirements from the registry. So the registry will allow you to do a project if it's 1 acre, but the question is, will it make sense for you to do AR in 1 acre? No. So for the registry, the more concerned with the policy guidelines, and then it is up to you to look at now the commercial or the economic guidelines, and of course to make sure that if you're doing a forest restoration project, are you in compliance with your host country, with your current government's respective laws and regulations? Because the gold standard will never allow you to register a project if it's in contravention with the host country guidelines. Just keep that in mind. Okay, just reiteration again. Okay, there are certain criteria that are very strict. Okay, very strict. Sorry for that. I noticed the last slide was not very clear. I'm just doing a quick recap in this next slide here about some of the guidelines. Is there is no country restriction. It must, of course, be voluntary because hey, the voluntary market. You must be able to make sure there's no double counting. What do I mean here? So let's say you're a developer, you don't own the land. You approach, let's say, the community. The community says, okay, let's do a project over the next 1,000 hectares. Let's do your projects. Very well, very nice. But remember, the community cannot register the project at the same time you register the project. You have to agree on what we call the representation of the project, who's the developer, whose name is going to appear on the carbon registry, and what is the revenue share and whatnot. Okay, so you have to make sure there's no double counting, and of course you have to ensure that there's no systematic deforestation within the last 10 years. Okay, and remember how we defined a forestry. As so how we define a forest, I think that's one to a question. I mentioned a forest has no more than 10% of tree cover, And number two, a tree is defined as what which is at maturity, it achieves about 5 meters in height. Okay, and of course you have to make sure that you're also in compliance with land use and forest special safeguards. For example, things to do with how I handle the gender components, labor laws and whatnot. Because again, the government is very keen on such kinds of safeguards. Because you're trying to make an emissions reduction claim, you have to demonstrate real outcomes. Okay, it's not just saying you're planting trees and not growing them. No, you have to walk the full mile and be able to demonstrate the real outcomes. Of course, additionality. You must be able to address additionality. The question is, how do we look at additionality? We'll cover in the next slide. I can see somebody talking about the FAC. Very well, very good, very good. Remember, you're doing this project within the community setting. You must inform them that, hey, we are so and so, we're trying to restore the forest in your area, and this is the reasons, and these are the possible benefits, financial or otherwise, and this is what you stand to benefit and allow us to build. So give the full information, because if you don't, as most of you know, that such cases will come to the carbon registries, the project is suspended until such issues are clarified. Okay, so let's make sure FAC is there too. Now, there's only so much we can say about additionality, but the key is that if you cannot prove additionality, then forget in totality about your dreams of the carbon project, because it's a fundamental principle of carbon projects. Now, you will know that when you look at the land use and forest requirements as given by the gold standard, you as a developer should be able to demonstrate the feasibility, should be able to demonstrate it within your feasibility report, and of course your project is document the PDD, and within the LUF requirements, you'll be able to see there is a positive list, which is a set of criteria that automatically deem a project is additional. Now, if you as a developer you find that you do not meet the requirements, then you'll be required to use the CDM tool 01, if you guys remember, CDM tool 01 to prove additionality. Okay, there are two approaches. First approach is you look at the positive list given in the gold standard LUF requirements. If, for example, you do not entirely meet that list, don't lose hope. Your last recourse is to look at the CDM tool 01 to see if you can still be able to prove additionality, and we shall be looking at CDM 201 in the next slide. Okay, so key to note is that the LUF requirements provides criteria where projects are deemed additional and not required to prove additionality at design certification. Simply meaning that if you're able to prove additionality by simply looking at the LUF requirements, then you can easily pass the design certification. Remember, design certification is the stage in which it allows your project to be officially registered. Remember, we mentioned that first of all, you've done your LSC, you give your reporting, you get listing status. For it to get registered status, we call it design certification, and it requires you to have proven some of these things with your validator. Now, as a developer, you must simply state in the PDD how your project meets the LUF requirements, positive list method. That is the bare minimum you're allowed to give. Okay, and you notice that the LUF requirements highlight 3 mandatory criteria and 4 additional criteria, all of which at least one must be met. Okay, to reiterate, there will be a number of criteria given in the LUF requirements plus additional criteria. You don't have to necessarily prove all of them. You need to prove at least one. I'm seeing there's a question here on whether Kenya is an LDC. No, Kenya is not an LDC country, but that doesn't automatically mean you're not meeting the LUF requirements, because the other LUF requirements. So the 3 mandatory LUF requirements is that number 1, the project is located in a least developed country. If not, let's look at the second mandatory requirement. The project has no intention of using timber or non-timber projects derived in the forest area for commercial purposes. Okay, remember the nuances I gave. That is the second requirement. If you cannot meet that, then the third option is the project activity is not mandatory by any law or regulation of the host country. You must meet at least one of them, one of those mandatory requirements, for you to be deemed additional if you're to go with the LUF requirements approach. Now, there are also 4 additional requirements that you will be required to achieve. I know these things are not necessarily in the screen, but we'll be able to share them with you, the PPT, and be able to see some of the notes. There are 4 additional requirements. Again, must at least one. The first one is the project region has annual precipitation of less than 600 millimeters mm. So now you have to go back to weather forecast and your geography to get this data. The second additional requirement that you can see to prove or not is project area has a soil pH of less than 4. Remember, I've said under the LUF, land use and forestry requirements, there are 2 sets of principles you have to meet for it to be deemed additional. What you call the mandatory criteria and there's additional criteria. You must have at least met 1 in the mandatory criteria and 1 in the additional criteria. Maybe Zara, you can just paste this mandatory additional criteria in the chat for them to be able to make sure I follow what I'm saying. And I've said for mandatory, the first one is projects located in the least developed country, LDC. If not, we go to the second mandatory requirements. The project has no intention of using timber or non-timber products derived from the forest area for commercial purposes. If you can't meet that one, you have the third option. The project activity is not mandatory by any law or regulation. In Kenya, there's a nationwide tree restoration project, which will then mean if you cannot meet these 3 mandatory requirements, your last option to prove additionality is you default to CDM 201, which we shall look at the next slide. Now, under additional requirements that you must prove at least 1, there are 4 additional requirements. The first one I said, the project region has annual precipitation of 600 millimeters. Number 2, or additional requirement number 2 that you can prove, you can't prove the first one is the project area has a soil pH of less than 4. Thirdly, if you can't prove the first 2, the other one you can prove is project activities plant 5 or more native species in mixed strands across at least 50% of the project area. Remember I mentioned that whereas there is no restriction to which specific species, the only restriction is 1, it should not be invasive, and 2, you must plant 5 or more native species in mixed strands across at least 50% of the project area. I think now you're starting to see now where things get a little bit complicated, but don't think of it as being complicated. Think of it as being making sure that whatever you're doing is a climate positive activity that goes towards tackling climate change. Last but not least, number 4 is the project is located in a small island development state or a country whose Human Development Index, HDI, is less than 0.5. Remember, more likely than not, if you're in some of the developed or the medium or high or a developed country, you're likely not to meet any one of these requirements to prove additionality, but don't worry. Okay, don't worry, because as you can see there, the other option is now we default to proving additionality by CDM tool 01. Nevertheless, please remember what we covered last week, and I said, even if you're able to prove your additionality by using the LUF requirements here, land use and forest requirement positive list, even if you prove your project has additionality in this approach, it does not harm if you go a step further and demonstrate additionality by way of CDM tool 01. The advantage to doing that is that it will speak better to potential investors or clients or buyers of credits to show that, hey, look, my project meets the LUF requirements under the gold standard, as well as those within CDM 201. But you are not required if you've been able to achieve it through LUF requirements. I hope I'm very clear. You've got 2 options to demonstrate additionality for an ARR project by making sure you're in compliance with either one of the mandatory and additional requirements of the LUF requirements, or if you're unable to do that, or even if you're able to do that, look at CDM 201. Okay, how do we go about CDM 201? Step 0. Demonstrate whether the proposed activity is first of its kind. IRR most likely is not the first of its kind. It's most likely something very common in your country. Yes, so you're the host country. So we go to step 1: identification of alternatives to the activities. Besides doing tree planting and growing, what other alternative is there? If there's no alternative, then you can go to the other exam. The other step is step 2, which is investment analysis. Now, this is really very, very interesting because this is where now you have to invest in having somebody who can help you in finance. Okay, you must do a proper project budget, business model, and then a financial model, and see and ask yourself a simple question: in the absence of carbon finance, in the absence of revenue coming from the sale of carbon credits, will my project be able to be implemented? If the answer is your project requires carbon finance for you to proceed, then you have been able to demonstrate additionality by investment analysis. However, there could be a possibility that whether or not you have got carbon finance or not, your project can still proceed to implementation. So that means you are not able to prove additionality by investment analysis. Do not worry. You still have step 3. Okay? I like using the example of a multi-billionaire or a multi-billion company that has billions of cash reserves. They might not be able to prove addition because maybe from their books of account and the way they design the projects, they can easily implement the project without carbon finance. So the CDM tool allows for another consideration to prove additionality, even though you might not be able to demonstrate additionality by way of investment analysis. And that is step number 3, barrier analysis. Okay? For the barrier analysis, maybe money is not the problem, but maybe there's a cultural practice that is going to hinder you being able to do the tree planting process. It could also be the fact that people have got an obsession to getting fuel wood, for example. So that's a cultural barrier. So if you're able to demonstrate that, and of course it must be backed up by studies, then you can demonstrate additionality by way of barrier analysis. However, if there are no barriers, you have got one last option to see if you can demonstrate additionality, and that is common practice analysis, which simply is asking, is it a common practice in your host country for people to, let's say, randomly be planting and growing trees? Is it a common practice for people to just go around the country chopping down trees? If it's the latter, that is, it's a common practice for people to just go around the country, chop down trees for firewood and all the things, then you have easily been able to demonstrate additionality by way of common practice analysis. If, however, you are still unable to demonstrate additionality through step number 4, and also you are unable to demonstrate additionality through the LUF requirements, then in also many words, your project is deemed not to be additional and will not be registered by the gold standard registry, which simply means we look for something else. We can still go on planting and growing the trees, but not for carbon certification purposes. I hope that point is very clear on how we look at additionality. In case something is not clear, please feel free to put it in the chat box. Or, for example, if you're currently designing a project and you want to look to see how best you can demonstrate additionality, you can do us an email and we'll be gladly be able to respond to you as soon as possible. My question to you, and I want this to be a discussion question in the chat, even beyond this webinar. My question is, an eligible error. I'm not sure if, sorry for this. So, an eligible project shall an eligible project that won't meet the definition of forest, that is deforestation in 10 years before the project start date, and the project start date, how can a project developer demonstrate this? Just a minute. Let me stop sharing to change the fonts. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. Just a minute, let me just change the fonts color. Okay. I'm trying to resume the sharing, just a minute. Okay. I hope that is now more legible. So the question is, an eligible area shall not meet the definition of forest 10 years before project start date and at project start date. How can a project developer demonstrate this? An eligible area shall not meet the definition of a forest 10 years before start date and at project start date. How can a project developer be able to demonstrate this? Okay. Remember, we talked about there should not have been a case of deforestation over the last 10 years. We have a very keen definition of what forest cover, what cover of trees must be there for defining it as a forest cover. So how can you as a developer be able to demonstrate this? Please feel free to put your answer in the chat box, and myself, Oziana, our colleagues will be reviewing your answers and be able to respond as to what speaks to the correct answer. Okay? Please put your answers in the chat box or the Q&A section. If you've got any question, again, please feel free to drop it. Otherwise, that marks the end of module 3, and we still have good time. We have about half an hour before the session ends to allow us to listen in on Ziana's delivery for module 4, which speaks to the implementation, monitoring, reporting. But again, if there's any project specification, please feel free to drop us an email, and or you can also ask in the chat box, and we'll be able to get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, allow me to welcome back Ziana to take us to the last module of the day. Thank you. Ziana.
All right, thanks, Charles. Let me share the last module. All right, so for our last module, we'll be looking at implementation, monitoring, and reporting. And we are going to learn about monitoring and reporting for a forestry project, just as we had mentioned before. There's Carbon First that are there are fictional projects in this webinar today. By the end, we hope that you'll be able to understand the monitoring requirements of an afforestation and reforestation project, how to appropriately implement a monitoring plan. And yes, let's get into it. So Carbon First are putting together their monitoring plan and are collecting data for the ex-ante calculations. They need to determine, one, what parameters are fixed, such as baseline land use parameters, except where biomass increases in the baseline, and values for wood density, biomass expansion factors, and root-to-shoot ratios, which I hope you can remember, as I had said a few modules before, that apart from the the stem volume, the others are default values that you can find. So the other thing that they will need to determine, the second thing, is parameters that need to be monitored ex post and estimated ex ante for the purpose of calculating the gold standard VERs, and finally develop a monitoring plan to calculate all the required data in line with the methodology. So when designing the monitoring plan, Carbon First will first need to take into account the stratification of the project into modeling units, with each modeling unit expected to have homogeneous characteristics such as soil quality and condition, baseline land use, and carbon stocks, and project carbon stocks. It may be that more modeling units have been created as the project continues due to variations in growth, as well as any biomass losses throughout the project area. Through the previous modules, Carbon First had identified at least 4 modeling units, with the first one being agriculture remaining agriculture, being converted to conservation forest through active planting. The other one was agriculture remaining agriculture, being converted to rotational forest through active planting. The third one, barren land remaining barren land, being converted to conservation forest through active planting. And the fourth one being barren land transitioning to savanna, being converted to conservation forest through active planting. So for each of these identified modeling unit, a separate set of statistically significant parameters will need to be monitored and measured. And to do this, this gold standard recommends the source book, as you can see on your screen, which is a source book for land use change, and forestry projects, keeping in mind that monitoring for afforestation and reforestation projects can be complex. They recommend that you use this source book to guide your developing of projects, such that it gives you the requirements that you need to meet in that align with what the CDM recommends. And additionally, the source book covers concepts such as additionality, baseline, leakage, and permanence, and how to monitor, measure, and analyze these parameters. So we will put a link to this source book that then you can find time, go through it. You can reach out maybe if you have any questions on it, but it can help you answer any concerns you may have regarding monitoring in our projects. Okay, so now a question to the audience. What are the key components of monitoring afforestation and reforestation projects? So what do you think are the key things we should be looking or assessing when we are monitoring in that projects? So again, just about maybe 20 seconds, put in your answers. My colleagues will mark them and see if we are on the same page. So as you type it out, I'll still give answers. So the growth and survival rate of the trees are the key components of monitoring, and this include biomass expansion factor. I hope you remember what that is, the wood density, tree growth rate, and the soil carbon stock. So now let's get into monitoring. So first, Carbon First will put together their monitoring plan to be validated in their PDD and executed during the project. They will consider what are the methodological requirements, what data must be collected, what is the sampling requirements. And most parameters they measure are collected using sampling plots. So first, they must determine their plot design and size, and there are multiple ways in which this can be conducted, with a few examples as you can see on your screen. So first, on A, those are the nested square plots, and then B, nested circular plots. C, transect plots. These are plots that are like in a line, and then D are nested plots. So variable or mixed plot approaches are also possible. Each plot design has their strengths and weaknesses, such as nested plots, which allow for more rapid assessments by increasing the minimum DPH of trees to be measured as the plot size increases, or transect plots, which allow for information gathering across a gradient or when site access may be an issue. When determining plot design, work with forestry experts to determine which is the best approach. So Carbon First has decided to use a circular nested plot design that has a radius of about 20 meters and now needs to estimate how many sample plots are required. So using a standard equation that you can see on the right side of the slide, where N represents total number of possible plots, E represents the allowable error, T the distribution at 95% confidence level, and S the standard deviation of the primary variable. In this case, this is the above ground biomass stock, with H denoting the separate strata. So standard deviation can be estimated through peer-reviewed data or a pilot study. And using this equation, Carbon First determined that 29 plots are required to fulfill the sampling requirements. So if there are any project developers in the room, they can utilize sampling calculators or they can create their own. Finally, Carbon First determines where these plots will be located, whether through random or stratified sampling or other approaches. It is possible that restrictions in terms of access can be developed to ensure that access to all these points is reasonable for time and safety purposes. Through sampling, Carbon First generates 29 random and accessible GPS coordinates from which the plots will originate from. Carbon First will also want the project to be a success and for the end users to benefit from the technology in the project. So they will plan for monthly visits to the sites to assess the tree survival and may even use drones to do so and hold continuous community events. So they also decide that they will also document every activity that they will undertake in this project, which will be helpful in demonstrating compliance to the VVBs and also to just tell anyone who is curious about what this project entails. So sampling and monitoring between the baseline and the project scenario is mostly similar. A key difference between the two scenarios is the requirement to also monitor non-tree biomass. This is primarily done through a quadrant approach, where the quadrants generally between 3 to 5 per plot, and these are randomly distributed throughout the plot. So destructive sampling, such as the harvesting and drying in an oven, or non-destructive, such as regression equations derived from ground cover and sward height, can be used. Additionally, soil carbon monitoring, if required by the project and not using published literature, will need to include coring, where soil cores are extracted from the ground, and the size of these soil cores are predetermined and are taken at a consistent depth using a tool known as an auger, and then these soil cores or the samples taken are then processed in a lab, or if you have a field kit, you can also use it to process, which then the results from this are then used to determine the soil organic carbon content. And also you can also check for other variables through when you're doing the soil testing. And the number of soil cores is generally consistent with the number of non-tree biomass quadrats. So Carbon First also needs to decide where subsequent sampling events will take place. The options will include permanent plots, where the same plots are monitored, to full replacement, where a new sample is developed, to a continuum in between. Most importantly for gold standard A&R projects is that plot design and monitoring can be highly variable, and as long as statistically significant measures are produced, it is recommended that project developers work with local forestry experts who can design an approach suitable for the ecosystem and characteristics of the area. Finally, Carbon First also decides that destructive sampling is the most appropriate sampling for the project in coordination with a local expert due to lack of established regression equations, and that full replacement plots will be used primarily to allow for a greater area to be monitored over the course of the project. So now, how do we conduct data collection? So the three main variables that we look at is one, the tree height, then two, the tree diameter at breast, which we have been abbreviating as DBH, and then also the soil organic carbon. So tree height is often considered a variable parameter in carbon sequestration projects, especially in A&R and forest management activities. It keeps on increasing or changing during the crediting period, and it's usually measured with an inclinometer. Tree diameter, also measured as the diameter at breast height, or DBH as I said, is usually typically about 1.3 meters, and it's a variable parameter in carbon sequestration and forestry projects. It keeps on increasing or changing, also just like the tree height during the project crediting period. And it's measured using a DBH tape, which varied approaches can be used based on the tree shape, as you can see in the slide. So depending on how your tree is, then you will adjust based on your how your tree is growing. Soil organic carbon finally is measured by analyzing a soil core in a lab to demonstrate soil organic carbon content. So I think I've explained the process of measuring soil organic carbon using the process of obtaining a soil core with an auger, then taking it to a lab. So now a question, I think this is our final question for the day to our audience. Why are local experts important for monitoring and afforestation and reforestation projects? So after all that, what do you think? Why should we engage local experts? So 20 seconds, think about it, type it in. Okay. So we engage local experts because they're the ones who have the most knowledge about the locality or the area that the project is being implemented. They also can assist to build and conduct a field monitoring plan. And also this can then be used to complement remote or digital monitoring. So in combination with field monitoring, Carbon First chooses to use remote sensing as a way to support the field data as well as reduce monitoring costs. And this, the first way is remote sensing, which remote sensing can be conducted either through using satellite imagery, LiDAR, which is the light detection and ranging, or drone imagery or drone surveys. So remote sensing can be used in a number of ways. This includes identifying current and historic land use, to check on the evidence of A&R activities in the area. It can also be used to extrapolate field data for greater accuracy of biomass estimates, and can also be used to monitor tree health and survival. So by Carbon First using remote sensing, they're able to add a premium to the credit price as investors have greater confidence in the ability of the project to ensure tree survival is as high as possible and that any losses are correctly and transparently monitored. So it is good to note that using only remote sensing monitoring approaches are currently not allowed under gold standard. So for gold standard, it is recommended or permitted that you use a hybrid approach that combines both remote sensing and on-the-ground calibration to then do your monitoring. And then finally, we come to the reporting. So as any project, you need to do your reporting. And for this, there are two main documents that are needed for reporting. First is the monitoring report, which is a crucial document that provides a comprehensive summary of the project's performance in terms of emissions, emission reductions, carbon sequestration, and contributions to the SDGs. The other type of report is the annual report. So this includes transparent annual update reports that will be provided for the projects that have achieved the project design certification stage or have successfully transitioned to gold standard for the global goals. An annual report shall be submitted for each monitoring year by end of next calendar year for which verification is not completed. And if verification is in progress but not completed, then an annual report is still required by the end of the calendar year. All project reporting must be conducted using the gold standard prescribed template, and this template is designed to capture all the necessary details, including the emission reductions, the sustainable development impacts, and also the monitoring data in a structured form. By adhering to the prescribed template, the developers can then streamline the review process and facilitate transparency to ensure that all the required information is provided in an organized and accessible manner. And in terms of the reporting frequency, the gold standard for global goals provides the deadlines as follows. So first, for the agriculture specific projects, the first verification project shall be completed either within 2 years of project start date or project design certification, whichever is later. 2, for the A&R specific projects, verification reports shall be completed at least every 5 years until the end of the crediting period. And then finally, for the VVB, so Just as a refresher, the VVB are the validation and verification bodies. These are directly appointed by the project developer, and a VVB shall be selected from the approved VVBs eligible for the project type and pathway proposed. So we will also put a link to the approved list of VVBs by gold standard in the chat, so that then you can also peruse through that. The VVB plays a critical role in conducting the performance review of the project, and they are accredited third-party organizations responsible for validating a project's design and verifying its actual performance in terms of emission reductions, carbon sequestration, and sustainable development contribution. And with that brings us to the end of our webinar and our last and final module. So if there are any questions regarding what I have shared or what Charles has shared, please post it in the chat. We'll try and answer it as soon as we can. I think now I'll hand it over back to Charles and Zure for the closing remarks. Thank you, everyone. Have a good Easter.
Thank you to Ziana, and thanks to you, the audience, for participating in today's session. It was a bit tricky for us to see, do you have the session on Friday or Saturday or even Thursday, knowing that most people are going offline in the literal sense. But thank you for taking time to listen to us. We hope the session has been productive. And again, we hope that by now most of you are seeing how best to tailor some of the projects you have in mind. But of course, if you have got any project questions, please feel free to do us an email or send a question. We are still looking at the questions and providing a response the same. We're also happy to know that some of you seem to have a good knowledge on certification for AR carbon projects, and you're supporting with even giving some of the responses, and we appreciate that. As you all know, this session was a part of the gold standard webinar series. Some has been supported by the German government and Somerset, and we're happy to make sure that we keep on supporting the ecosystem on matters of carbon project. That said, with the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, as well as email, depending on your preference, but you'll be able to get this via email plus the slides as well on the YouTube channel. That said, thank you for hosting us.